I am Miller Files, and if you are hearing this story now, I want you to understand that what I am about to unfold is not a simple crime narrative. It is one of those rare cases where even a seasoned investigator like me finds himself lingering at the edge of disbelief, not because of the violence involved, but because the origin of that violence began inside the imagination of a child who believed she had to kill her best friend to please a figure that existed only on the internet. Waukesha, Wisconsin, is the kind of town people describe as a place where nothing bad ever happens. A quiet Midwestern community where kids ride bicycles without supervision, where doors are often left unlocked, and where laughter floats easily through tree-lined streets on summer evenings. Safety is not a privilege there. It is an assumption. That is what makes this case so unsettling. The place most Americans would pick to raise a family, a place that feels immune to darkness, became the stage for a crime that would spread across headlines around the world. Peyton Leutner, the victim, was a gentle, intelligent, soft-spoken girl. In medical reports that came later, doctors described her as a fighter who clung to life with pure will. But before all that, she was simply a child who trusted her friends. She had no reason to doubt Morgan Geyser or Anissa Weier. She had no way to imagine that the two girls she loved like sisters had spent months nurturing a shared delusion in the shadowy corners of the internet. The night before the attack was ordinary. A birthday sleepover, cake, whispered conversations, shared secrets under dim bedroom lights. 3 12-year-old girls inside sleeping bags, talking about school, about jokes, about stories they had read online. Peyton went to sleep thinking the next morning would be filled with more of the same. But Morgan and Anissa had been living in a different world long before that night. A world built from creepypastas, from horror sites, from digital mythologies that children absorb without filters. A world where Slender Man was not a meme or a joke, but an entity watching them, demanding from them, threatening them. Morning came with the soft kind of sunlight that makes everything look harmless. The 3 girls walked together toward the park. No parent watching from a window would have sensed danger. They looked like every other group of friends walking together on a weekend, laughing, nudging each other, stepping over cracks in the pavement. Yet between the 2 girls who carried the secret, a quiet resolve lingered. Peyton walked in the middle, unaware that she was already inside a story the other 2 had scripted for months. Once inside the park, Morgan and Anissa tried to initiate the attack earlier inside a bathroom stall. Morgan froze. That hesitation told me something important about her mind. A healthy child would hesitate because harming a friend is unthinkable. Morgan hesitated because her mind was torn between 2 realities, the real one and the one constructed by her untreated psychosis. She was not negotiating morality. She was negotiating fear. The fear of disappointing a creature she believed was capable of killing her entire family. The girls wandered deeper into the wooded area. For Peyton, it was still a game. For the other 2, it was the final stretch of what they believed to be a ritual. The woods were not dark or ominous. Sunlight filtered through the branches, illuminating dirt paths and fallen leaves. It was beautiful in the way childhood landscapes often are, and yet beauty meant nothing on that day. What mattered was the intent brewing beneath the surface, unseen by any adult. Anissa gently guided Peyton to a spot near a log. They told her to play hide and seek. She agreed without a hint of suspicion. That blind trust is what breaks my heart every time I revisit this case. Children trust without hesitation. They assume safety. They assume friends cannot hurt them. It is in their nature. When they reached the clearing, something shifted. Anissa pushed Peyton to the ground. Peyton was confused rather than frightened. She asked, "Why are you doing this?" The words came out not as accusation, but as a sincere request for explanation. Morgan climbed on top of her. The knife came out, a kitchen knife from Morgan's home hidden in her clothes since morning. The first stab was shallow. Peyton screamed, not because she understood she was being murdered, but because she could not comprehend betrayal. She kept asking her friends to stop. She asked them what was happening. She tried to crawl away, but Morgan's delusion had already swallowed her whole. 19 stab wounds followed, uneven, frantic, trembling stabs, not the stabs of rage, the stabs of a child following a voice inside her mind. When the girl stepped back, Peyton was left bleeding on the forest floor. Morgan told her to lie still, so she would lose less blood. The words were delivered with the calmness of someone reciting instructions. Then Morgan and Anissa walked away, as though the event was already behind them. They believed the sacrifice was complete. They believed Slenderman would now accept them, protect them, invite them into his imaginary mansion deep in the Nicollet National Forest. But Peyton did not die. She dragged herself from the forest inch by inch. A girl who had been betrayed by her closest friends somehow found the strength to save herself. When a passing cyclist found her, she whispered the words, "I need help." That whisper changed everything. Her survival opened the door to the truth. The police search for Morgan and Anissa began within minutes. They were found walking along a highway, calm, carrying a backpack with snacks, water, drawings of Slenderman, and a letter explaining why they had to leave home. They told officers they were going to meet Slenderman in the woods. They truly believed it. Interrogations revealed the depth of Morgan's illness. She spoke of Slenderman as though he were real, as though he had watched her for years. Anissa, less delusional but completely consumed by fear, admitted she allowed herself to believe everything Morgan said. Their minds had fused into a shared delusion, something rare but not impossible among children who lack emotional grounding. As the legal system moved in, the conflict between law and psychology grew impossible to ignore. Prosecutors saw attempted murder. Psychiatrists saw untreated mental illness. The courtroom became a battlefield between two truths that could both exist at the same time. Morgan showed clear signs of early-onset schizophrenia. Anissa showed a psychological vulnerability that made her easy to influence. Neither girl fully understood the reality of their actions. Yet Peyton, the survivor, carried wounds beyond the physical ones. She had to rebuild trust, rebuild her sense of safety, rebuild her belief that the world was not filled with hidden threats. She learned to walk into school again. She learned to sleep without fear. She learned, in a way, no 12-year-old should ever have to that evil sometimes comes disguised as friendship. In the end, Morgan was committed to a secure psychiatric facility where she would spend years undergoing treatment. Anissa was placed under extended psychiatric supervision, and Peyton walked forward with courage stronger than anything I have witnessed in my career. The case did not end with villains and heroes. It ended with 3 children whose lives were forever split into before and after. It ended with a warning that the greatest dangers are not always lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they are inside the glowing screens children stare into when no one is watching. Sometimes they are inside minds too young to defend themselves. It is the kind of case that never truly leaves the investigator behind. And even now, years later, when I close the final folder in the Slenderman case file, I know I am not simply closing paperwork. I am closing a reminder of how fragile young minds can be and how deeply a single myth can burrow when no adult is there to illuminate what is real and what is not. Morgan's placement in a psychiatric institution marked the beginning of a long and complicated process, rather than the end of one. Treatment for early-onset schizophrenia is a marathon, not a sprint, and the doctors who examined her made one thing painfully clear. Her psychosis had been forming long before the crime. The signs had been subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Whispers of paranoia, fleeting hallucinations, thoughts that drifted further and further from reality. Her childhood drawings included faceless figures long before she ever learned what Slenderman was. Her fear of imaginary creatures had escalated gradually, merging with her loneliness and her difficulty interpreting social cues. By the time she discovered creepypasta stories on the internet, the illness had already built a doorway, and Slenderman simply walked through it. During one psychiatric evaluation, a doctor asked Morgan if she remembered the moment she decided Peyton needed to die. Morgan answered without hesitation, describing a quiet inner voice that told her she was being watched. She believed that refusing the command would condemn her whole family. She believed Slenderman had been threatening her for years. The doctor later wrote in his report that it was one of the clearest, most tragic examples of delusional thinking he had ever encountered in a child. Her illness had not made her violent by nature. It had made her terrified. Anissa's psychological examinations revealed a different struggle. She did not suffer from hallucinations or delusions on her own. Her vulnerability came from deep social anxiety, emotional dependence, and an overwhelming need to belong. She had never been the leader in any friend group. She had always been the follower, the one who sought validation from others. When Morgan spoke to her with certainty about Slenderman, that certainty became its own gravity. Anissa described it later as feeling like she was being swept into a current she could not swim against. The doctors called it shared delusional disorder, or folie-du-du-du, a phenomenon where one person's psychosis transfers to another who is susceptible. It is rare, but among adolescents under emotional stress, it can form with frightening speed. The legal system struggled to categorize what Morgan and Anissa had done. In the eyes of the law, attempted first-degree murder was the primary charge. But the question that haunted every courtroom session was whether two 12-year-olds could truly understand their actions. The state of Wisconsin had statutes allowing children as young as 10 to be tried as adults for serious crimes. But the defense argued that Morgan's mental state made adult prosecution inappropriate. The prosecutors countered that the severity of the violence 19 stab wounds required an equally severe response. I sat through hearings where experts debated issues that extended far beyond this case. They argued about how the justice system should treat mentally ill minors. They debated whether children can be held to the same standards of accountability as adults. They analyzed the impact of digital folklore on developing brains. The truth is that this case was not just about 3 girls. It was about an entire society trying to keep up with the invisible psychological impact of the online world. The testimonies were haunting. One psychiatrist described Morgan's inability to distinguish fantasy from reality as profoundly impaired. Another specialist explained that Anissa's fear of Slenderman was not a simple misunderstanding. It was an emotional belief powerful enough to override her ethical judgment. Expert after expert pointed out that children at that age often do not have the neurological maturity required to evaluate risks, consequences, or the reliability of the information they consume. During one hearing, the judge asked Morgan if she understood why she was being detained. She responded with a question of her own. "Is he angry at me?" The judge looked confused and asked who she meant. Morgan answered softly, "Slender Man." The courtroom froze. That single exchange made everything painfully clear. She was not playing a role. She was not pretending. She was still trapped in the same delusion that had nearly killed her best friend. Meanwhile, Peyton was fighting a different battle, the battle to reclaim her life. Physical recovery took months. The emotional recovery far longer. Nightmares, sudden panic attacks. A fear of being watched that mirrored the very delusions Morgan had suffered. Except Peyton's fear came from reality, not imagination. It came from the knowledge that a friend she loved had nearly taken her life. Her resilience was remarkable, but even resilience cannot erase trauma. She grew cautious, guarded, older than her age in ways no one could measure. Her family protected her fiercely. They implemented new boundaries, checked in constantly, guided her back into routines one small step at a time. They avoided mentioning Morgan unless necessary, and even then, only in gentle tones. But Peyton understood in her own quiet way that her life had split into two chapters before the forest. And after the forest, what she endured reshaped how she saw friendship, trust, and safety. And yet, she was determined not to let fear define her. Over the months and years that followed, the legal process slowly moved towards sentencing. Journalists crowded outside the courthouse. True crime enthusiasts debated the moral implications online. Mental health advocates used the case as a painful example of everything society fails to notice in children until it is too late. Some people saw Morgan and Anissa as monsters. Others saw them as victims of circumstances beyond their understanding. But few opinions captured the complexity of the situation. When the final decisions came down, they reflected that complexity. Morgan was committed to a psychiatric institution for decades, with the possibility of extended supervision, depending on her progress. Anissa was sentenced to long-term psychiatric supervision as well, though with more potential for reintegration. Both sentences acknowledged that the girls were dangerous, not because of malice, but because their minds had betrayed them. As an investigator, I have always believed that justice is not simply about punishment. It is about understanding. And in this case, understanding required peeling back layers of fear, illness, influence, and technological exposure. It demanded that we look at how children interpret the world, how they cling to stories when reality feels too uncertain, how myths can fill the spaces left empty by confusion or loneliness. Peyton's courage became the light at the center of this painful narrative. She demonstrated not just the will to survive, but the will to rebuild. In interviews years later, she spoke with a calm maturity that belied her age. She refused to let the attack define her. She refused to surrender her future to the shadow of Slender Man or the memories of betrayal. She learned to trust again, carefully, slowly, but genuinely. For Morgan, the path ahead will always be shaped by her illness. Whether she ever fully grasps what happened that morning is uncertain. Her delusions were not created overnight, and they did not vanish when the handcuffs closed on her wrists. Treatment may help her understand pieces of the truth, but some pieces may always remain beyond her reach. As for Anissa, she carries a different burden, the knowledge that she played a role in an unspeakable act, even without the illness that controlled Morgan. Her rehabilitation focuses on helping her build an identity independent of fear and dependence, teaching her to trust her own judgment rather than the influence of others. Years later, I still think about the forest, about the quiet clearing where 3 children stepped into a moment that would change their lives forever, about the innocence lost there, about how thin the line can be between imagination and reality in the mind of a child. I think about the way technology can create invisible corridors where fears grow unchecked, where children wander without guidance, where myths become commands. The Slenderman case was never simply a crime. It was a warning, a painful reminder that the greatest dangers are sometimes the ones we do not see coming because we never thought to look. A reminder that children do not live in separate worlds from adults. They live in the same world, but experience it differently. And without guidance, without attention, without someone to ask the right questions at the right time, even the bright and ordinary corners of childhood can become shadows. The farther I traveled from the courthouse and its echoes of competing arguments, the more I found myself thinking about the silence that surrounded all 3 girls before the crime took place. Silence in the home, silence in the classroom, silence in the minds of adults who never realized the depth of what was happening online. Silence is the most dangerous companion a frightened child can have. It allows fear to grow unchecked, transforms imagination into threat, and lets illusions settle into the cracks of a young mind. For Morgan and Anissa, silence became the soil in which Slenderman took root. As investigators, we combed through months of digital footprints, internet searches at odd hours, scribbled notebook drawings of tall, faceless figures, online forums where children tried to scare one another with stories they didn't fully understand. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became that both girls had been living inside their own version of a digital underworld long before the attack. They were reading horror narratives not as fiction, but as emerging truths. Every edited image, every fabricated e-witness account, every shadowy video had been accepted as evidence. And in the absence of an adult to explain the boundary between storytelling and reality, those boundaries simply dissolved. One particular search history stood out to me, a series of late-night queries typed by Morgan months before the attack. Is Slenderman real? Can Slenderman read minds? What happens if you disobey Slenderman? These weren't the idle curiosities of a child looking for a thrill. They were the frantic questions of someone who believed she was being hunted, someone who believed she was living under surveillance, someone whose fear had fused with fiction until both became indistinguishable. Yet none of this had been visible to those around her. Morgan's teachers described her as quirky but intelligent. Her parents described her as imaginative. No one observed the hallucinations that had already started to shape her worldview. She hid them because she believed they were normal, because children often assume their thoughts mirror everyone else's. And when the illness intensified, she hid them because the voices told her to. Anissa's digital trail told a different story. She spent hours reading creepypastas, diving into comments where children dared each other to believe in monsters. She watched videos with ominous music and shaky camera footage, claiming Slenderman had been sighted in forests and abandoned buildings. She didn't have the cognitive defenses needed to evaluate what she saw. She didn't understand that adults created these stories as entertainment. She read them alone, late at night, letting her imagination amplify every detail. Over time, she convinced herself she was being observed too. When you put 2 frightened minds together, sharing the same language of fear, the result can become something larger than either one could create alone. A shared delusion grows faster than an individual one because it gains reinforcement. Every time Morgan expressed fear, Anissa validated it. Every time Anissa expressed doubt, Morgan supplied invented evidence. Their friendship became a psychological feedback loop, building until it eclipsed any sense of rationality they once had. The months after the attack were filled with interviews, evaluations, hearings, and reports, each one peeling back another layer of the tragedy. Some nights, I stayed late at my desk rereading Peyton's medical statements. They were clinical, detached, but behind the sterile language of blood loss and organ damage, I could sense the terror she must have felt lying on the forest floor, wondering why her friends would do such a thing. The fact that she lived was almost miraculous. Doctors had said the knife missed her heart by less than a millimeter. The difference between life and death had been smaller than a grain of sand. As Peyton healed physically, her emotional recovery followed a different rhythm. Post-traumatic flashbacks, sudden waves of panic, fear of being alone. But she refused to withdraw permanently. She returned to school. She laughed again. Slowly, she rebuilt the sense of safety that had been ripped from her. Her parents had taught her resilience long before the attack, and that resilience became the armor she wore as she walked back into the world. By contrast, Morgan's world narrowed to the walls of her treatment facility. Daily therapy sessions tried to teach her the difference between delusion and reality. Medications attempted to quiet the hallucinations that had dominated her inner life. Some days she improved. Other days she slipped backward, asking staff whether Slenderman still watched her. Her illness was not a wound that could be stitched closed. It was a long road of management and slow adjustment, and no one could predict exactly where it would lead. Anissa's treatment focused on helping her recognize her patterns of dependency and fear-driven thinking. She practiced decision-making exercises. She learned how to question her own beliefs before accepting someone else's. She was taught how to identify emotional manipulation. Even when unintended, she carried guilt, a heavy kind that settled deep in her conscience. She had not wielded the knife, but she had fueled the delusion. And she understood this. Every time she spoke about Peyton, tears welled behind her eyes. The weight of responsibility was one she would carry far into adulthood. Throughout these months, public opinion shifted constantly. Commentators argued about parental responsibility, about the dangers of unsupervised internet access, about mental health screening in schools. Some blamed violent media. Others blamed the justice system. Still, others blamed the girls themselves, ignoring the complex web of psychological factors that had shaped their actions. But I found myself returning to one idea. Children see the world differently. They absorb stories emotionally, deeply, without filters. They are vulnerable to fear in ways adults often forget. They do not always understand where fiction ends and reality begins. In a world flooded with digital myths, that confusion can grow into something disastrous if left unaddressed. I remember the day I closed the investigative phase of the case. It was late evening, and the office lights were dimming as staff headed home. I lingered, reading once more the earliest notes from the crime scene. 3 sets of footprints leading into the woods, 2 sets walking out. In that simplicity lay the entire heartbreak of the case. 3 children entered a story together. Only one emerged, still connected to reality. Even now, when I revisit the memory, I think about all the moments where intervention might have changed the outcome. A teacher noticing a notebook filled with disturbing drawings. A parent asking why their child was suddenly afraid of shadows. A conversation about the difference between fiction and truth. Small moments. Missed opportunities. Moments that might have redirected everything. As the years moved forward, The story of the Slenderman stabbing remained in the public consciousness, not because people wanted to sensationalize the tragedy, but because it represented something so deeply unsettling about the intersection of childhood innocence and the unseen dangers of a digital age. Every conference, every panel, every documentary that revisited the case circled back to the same haunting questions. How could two children slip so far into a delusion without anyone noticing? What does it mean for parents raising children in a world where the internet seems as real as any physical space? And how do we protect young minds from myths that feel indistinguishable from truth? I spoke to more experts than I could count: psychologists, digital culture researchers, child development specialists. Their insights varied, but a pattern emerged. Children absorb digital stories not as entertainment, but as alternate realities they might inhabit. In their minds, the boundary between narrative and truth begins to blur when emotions become involved. Fear especially gives fictional threats an alarming power, and fear was the emotional language that shaped Morgan and Anissa's decisions. One researcher told me that online horror tales act like mirrors. They reflect back the anxieties children already carry inside themselves. Morgan's mind was already vulnerable, already looking for explanations to the voices she heard and the shadows she imagined. Slenderman gave her a name for those fears. Anissa's loneliness and desire to belong made her susceptible to adopting beliefs that anchored her to someone stronger. Slenderman became the shared mythology that unified them. It didn't matter that it wasn't real. What mattered was that it explained their inner chaos. During a visit to the treatment facility, I observed Morgan through a glass window as she colored in a quiet room. She looked younger than her age, almost childlike in the way she concentrated on the page. Her hair fell around her face, obscuring her expression. When a therapist sat beside her, she smiled faintly, as though unaware of everything she had been through. Moments later, her expression shifted, and she whispered something to the therapist, who gently corrected her. The staff later told me she had asked whether the tall man still checked on her at night. That moment crystallized something that had been building in me since the first day of the investigation. Morgan was not a villain. She was a child whose world had fractured long before she ever walked into that forest. The tragedy was not just what she did, but what she had been. Living with, in silence, her illness had tricked her into believing she was acting out of necessity. That is a type of horror most adults cannot comprehend. Anissa's path looked different. I met her at a supervised therapy session where she practiced grounding exercises. She spoke with a soft voice. Her shoulders slumped slightly inward, as though she still carried the weight of her choices. When she talked about the attack, she didn't describe her actions with excuses. She described them with regret so heavy it seemed to press down on every syllable she uttered. She admitted she wanted acceptance so badly that she ignored her own fear. She said she believed helping Morgan would protect her from the monster she thought was watching her. And yet, she also spoke about Peyton with genuine affection, describing moments from their shared childhood that made it clear the betrayal still haunted her. Both girls were shaped by vulnerabilities that collided at the worst possible moment. Morgan's illness controlled her worldview. Anissa's dependency fed the delusion. Understanding that doesn't justify what happened, but it explains how something so unthinkable could arise from minds so young. Peyton's journey continued on a different plane entirely. She regained her strength, not through avoidance, but through confronting the trauma head-on. She spoke openly about her fears with therapists, allowing herself to process the memories rather than bury them. She joined school clubs, built new friendships, took small risks that helped her reclaim normalcy. Her courage became a beacon for others facing trauma. In interviews, she spoke without bitterness, choosing instead to focus on her survival and her future. That kind of emotional maturity is rare at any age, but especially remarkable for someone who had endured what she did. Her family remained at her side every step of the way. They created a home environment grounded in reassurance and honesty. They answered her questions, no matter how painful. They encouraged her independence without rushing it. The love she received became a crucial counterweight to the terror she had experienced in the woods. Through her resilience, she became a symbol not of victimhood, but of perseverance. Over time, the public discourse surrounding the case evolved. Conversations expanded from the sensational details to the broader implications. Educators introduced digital literacy programs to teach children the difference between narrative fiction and factual information. Parents became more aware of the need to understand the online spaces their children inhabit. Psychiatrists and advocates used the case as evidence for improving mental health resources in schools. In that sense, the tragedy sparked a necessary cultural reckoning. But that reckoning came at the cost of 3 irrevocably altered childhoods. In quieter moments, I often found myself replaying the investigation in my mind, not the crime scene or the interrogations, but the subtler signals that preceded the tragedy, the drawings, the late-night searches, the whispered fears, the unquestioned assumptions. Adults dismiss such things as imagination or phases, unaware that sometimes they are symptoms of something deeper. I couldn't help but wonder how many other children out there were harboring fears too overwhelming to articulate, fears fueled by stories that were never meant to be taken literally. I also thought about how society tends to simplify narratives for comfort. People want clear roles, clear motives, clear heroes and villains. But this case allowed for none of that. There was no simplicity here, only layers of context that complicated every conclusion. It forced everyone involved to confront the uncomfortable truth that children are not immune to psychological breakdowns, and that innocence does not protect them from believing in dangers that do not exist. Even now, years after the sentencing, I sometimes revisit the quiet street where Peyton grew up. The houses look the same. The trees sway the same. But for those who live through that time, the town carries a subtle shift in its atmosphere. A kind of collective awareness that darkness isn't always external. Sometimes it grows from the inside out, fed by isolation, fear, and unexamined influences. And sometimes, as in this case, it grows inside children who never wanted to be anything but normal. The Slenderman Stabbing is not just a file in my cabinet. It is a reminder of the fragility of childhood, the importance of vigilance, and the need for conversations that reach deeper than surface-level reassurances. It is a reminder that when children withdraw into imaginary worlds, adults must not simply hope they will come back. They must follow them in, ask questions, illuminate the shadows, and ensure that fear does not become a companion that whispers instructions in the dark. As the investigation wound down and the courtroom doors eventually closed, the Slenderman case settled into a quiet but permanent place within me. There are cases that conclude cleanly, with certainty and resolution. This was not one of them. This case lived in the liminal space between crime and tragedy, between accountability and illness, between the world children imagine and the world they inhabit. Even today, I find myself returning to it, not because of morbid fascination, but because of the uncomfortable truths it revealed about how vulnerable young minds can be. In the years that followed, I continued to receive updates from those involved. Morgan's progress reports were clinical, filled with medical terminology describing the ebb and flow of her condition. Some entries detailed moments of clarity where she acknowledged the fictional nature of Slender Man. Others described setbacks where old fears resurfaced, convincing her once again that she was being watched. Her doctors worked tirelessly, adjusting medications, guiding her through therapy sessions, and attempting to strengthen the tools she needed to distinguish reality from delusion. I often wondered what her life might have looked like had her illness been caught earlier. Would she have built friendships rooted in trust rather than fear? Would she have developed coping mechanisms to counter the voices that haunted her? The tragedy of her story is not only the act she committed, but the years she spent navigating a terrifying internal landscape without anyone realizing she was lost. Her mind betrayed her long before she betrayed Peyton. Anissa's path was quieter, but no less complicated. She participated in intensive therapy centered on self-awareness, critical thinking, and boundary setting. She learned how to form her own opinions rather than absorbing the beliefs of others. She learned how to question her fears rather than letting them guide her. She learned to identify the difference between loyalty and blind obedience. Rehabilitation was not about reshaping her into someone new. It was about helping her uncover the person she might have been, had fear not distorted her judgment. During one of her reviews, a therapist wrote about Anissa's overwhelming guilt. She cried often during sessions, replaying moments from that morning in the woods. She talked about Peyton with aching remorse, unable to reconcile the friend she cherished with the harm she helped create. Her guilt, while emotionally devastating, became a driving force in her treatment, pushing her toward accountability rather than denial. And then there was Peyton. Her life remains the clearest testament to survival I have ever witnessed. Not just physical survival, but emotional and psychological endurance. She grew into a young woman who understood her trauma without letting it define her. Her perspective became grounded, wise, resilient. She spoke publicly about the importance of mental health awareness, of recognizing warning signs, of the dangers that lurk behind the anonymity of the internet. She became a symbol of what it means to reclaim power after it has been violently taken. Her family's steadfast support played a crucial role in her healing. They built an environment where she felt heard, seen, and protected. They guided her through the labyrinth of trauma with patience and strength. The love they provided became the foundation upon which she rebuilt her identity. Peyton emerged not as someone broken, but as someone transformed. Over time, the media's attention shifted elsewhere, as it always does. Other tragedies captured headlines, other debates emerged, other fears took hold. But the Slenderman case continued to echo in academic circles, parenting forums, and mental health conferences. It became a study in the complexities of adolescent psychology, the influence of digital culture, and the responsibilities adults bear when engaging with children's inner worlds. It reminded people that the digital realm is not a passive environment. It is a living ecosystem that shapes beliefs, fears, and behaviors in ways that are not always visible until it is too late. When I reflect on the case now, what stands out most is not the crime itself, but the convergence of factors that allowed it to happen. A child with untreated psychosis, another child desperate for belonging, a myth born in the corners of the internet, a lack of communication, a lack of understanding, a silence that grew too loud to ignore. These pieces formed a puzzle no one saw until the picture was complete, and by then it was already far too late. I often think about the moment Peyton crawled out of the woods. That image stays with me more vividly than any crime scene I have ever encountered. A wounded child dragging herself toward life, toward help, toward a future she refused to let slip away. That moment embodies the strength of the human spirit in a way textbooks could never convey. It is the reason she survived. It is the reason this case, despite its darkness, contains a glimmer of light. And I think about Morgan, a girl who was never taught how to decode the signals of her own mind, trapped inside illusions she believed were real. Her actions cannot be undone, but they can be understood. Her illness does not absolve her of responsibility, but it reframes it. She is not a monster. She is a cautionary tale of what happens when mental illness goes unnoticed and untreated in a child who has no language to describe what she feels. I think about Anissa as well, a girl who made a catastrophic choice, not out of malice, but out of terror, influenced by a friendship she misunderstood as salvation. Her story is a reminder of the crucial need to teach children how to stand on their own emotional footing, how to question their own fears, and how to differentiate imagination from truth. But above all, I think about the responsibility we all share. Parents, teachers, investigators, mental health professionals, community members, the responsibility to pay attention, to listen, to look deeper when a child says they are afraid, to ask what they believe and why, to explore the worlds they disappear into when they close their bedroom door. Because children do not suffer in isolation. They suffer in silence, hoping someone will notice. The Slenderman case taught me that evil is not always intentional. Sometimes it is the tragic outcome of vulnerability, illness, and misunderstanding converging at the wrong moment. Sometimes the darkest acts emerge from minds too young to grasp the weight of their decisions. And sometimes the most resilient heroes are those who survive those acts and choose to rise again. Years after the incident, I visited the forest one last time. The clearing looked unchanged. Sunlight still filtered through the branches. Birds still sang. The air still held the same quiet stillness. But for me, the place carried a solemn heaviness. It was the site of unimaginable pain, but also the site of unimaginable strength. It was where innocence ended and where resilience began. As I stood there, I realized that the greatest lesson of this case was not about monsters, whether real or imagined. It was about the fragile line between childhood fantasy and reality, and the importance of the adults who are meant to guide children across that line safely. When that guidance is absent, myths can become mandates and fears can become actions. It is not enough to warn children about the dangers of the world. We must also illuminate the confusing landscapes inside their minds. When I finally closed the final file and stepped away from the case for good, I understood that not all conclusions offer closure. Some offer only understanding. Some offer only reminders. And some, like this one, offer a bittersweet truth, that in the balance between darkness and light, even the smallest spark of resilience can lead a child out of the woods.